As a student, what is the saddest thing you have found out about your teacher? Growing up, I always believed teachers were superheroes, capable of solving any problem and always possessing the answers. They stood at the front of the class, holding a quiet authority, commanding respect. They were the ones who taught us about the world, prepared us for the future, and always seemed like they had their lives together. But there was one teacher, Mr. Reynolds, who changed my view on teachers forever. This is a story about the saddest thing I've ever learned about a teacher, one that shattered my illusions and gave me a whole new perspective on life. Mr. Reynolds had always been a bit of an enigma. He was in his late 40s, balding, and wore thick glasses that magnified his kind, tired eyes. He wasn't the most exciting teacher, but he had a calmness about him that made the classroom feel like a safe place. He taught history, but what stood out more than his lessons was the way he treated his students. He wasn't the strict type, nor was he the teacher that made jokes to win popularity. He was simply kind. He listened. He made you feel heard. For years, I noticed that he often came to class with a coffee cup in hand, but he rarely drank from it. I never thought much of it back then, but hindsight is a cruel thing. He always dressed neatly, though his clothes were old and worn, and his briefcase was falling apart at the edges. Still, he smiled softly as he taught us about wars, revolutions, and civilizations that rose and fell. It was strange now to think that his own life had been quietly falling apart, even as he stood before us, day after day, teaching us about history. It was in my senior year of high school that the cracks in Mr. Reynolds' facade became more noticeable. He began coming to class late, unheard of for someone like him, and his usual composure started to falter. He fumbled with his papers, seemed distracted during lessons, and more than once, I caught him staring out of the window with a distant look in his eyes, as though he were somewhere far away, locked in a memory he couldn't escape. One day, after class, a couple of my friends and I stayed behind to ask him questions about an upcoming test. As we approached his desk, we noticed that he was sitting there, rubbing his temples, his eyes closed. When we spoke, he jolted upright, blinking rapidly as though he'd just woken from a nightmare. There was an awkward silence as he collected himself, but his usually steady hands were shaking. "Are you okay, Mr. Reynolds?" one of my friends asked. He smiled that tired, familiar smile and nodded. "Just a bit under the weather. Nothing to worry about." But I could tell that something was very wrong. A few weeks later, rumors started circulating around the school that Mr. Reynolds had been in a car accident. The whisper spread like wildfire, fueled by teenage curiosity and a hunger for gossip. The story was that he had fallen asleep at the wheel and crashed into a tree. Thankfully, no one else was involved, and Mr. Reynolds had escaped with only minor injuries. But the fact that he had fallen asleep while driving set off alarms in my mind. This wasn't like him at all. When Mr. Reynolds returned to school after a week of medical leave, I noticed a difference. His tiredness wasn't just physical anymore. There was something deeper, a sadness that seemed to hang over him like a dark cloud. He tried to carry on as usual, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. He would pause in the middle of a sentence, lose track of his thoughts, and sometimes even forget what he was teaching. It was painful to watch. One day, after another disjointed lesson, I stayed behind. I wanted to ask him if he was really okay, but I didn't know how to approach it. I stood by his desk as he packed up his things. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though every action required immense effort. "Mr. Reynolds," I started, unsure of how to continue. "Is everything all right?" He glanced up at me, his eyes shadowed by fatigue. For a moment, I thought he might brush me off with another vague reassurance, but something in my expression must have struck a chord. He sighed heavily and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. "You're a good kid," he said quietly. "I appreciate you asking." There was a long pause, during which I felt my heart pounding in my chest. And then, to my surprise, he started to talk. "You ever feel like you're just surviving? Like you're going through the motions every day, pretending everything's fine when, in reality, it's anything but?" I nodded, though I didn't fully understand. I was a high school student, my biggest worries were grades, friends, and college applications. But there was something so raw in the way he spoke, a deep, unspoken pain that resonated with me even though I couldn't fully grasp it. He exhaled slowly and stared at his hands. "I used to love teaching. It gave me a sense of purpose, a reason to get out of bed in the morning. But somewhere along the line, I lost that. And now, every day is just a struggle to keep going." I didn't know what to say. What could I say? I was just a kid, and here was my teacher, a man I had always looked up to, admitting that he was barely holding on. Over the next few months, Mr. Reynolds' health continued to decline. He started missing more classes, and when he was there, his lessons were scattered, disorganized. It was heartbreaking to see him like this. I couldn't help but wonder what had happened to him, what had caused this once passionate man to lose all sense of hope. Then, one afternoon, everything changed. I had stayed after school for a group project, and as I was walking through the empty hallways, I saw Mr. Reynolds leaving the principal's office. His face was pale, and his hands were trembling as he clutched a letter to his chest. He didn't see me, and I watched as he quickly disappeared down the hall. Curiosity got the better of me, and I knocked on the principal's door. Mrs. Carmichael, our no-nonsense principal, was sitting at her desk, looking as though the weight of the world was on her shoulders. "Is everything okay?" I asked cautiously. She sighed and shook her head. "Mr. Reynolds has been going through a lot," she said softly. "It's not my place to share personal details, but he's been dealing with some serious family issues. His wife passed away last year, and since then, things have been very difficult for him." My heart sank. I had no idea. None of us did. We all assumed that Mr. Reynolds was just another teacher, living his life outside of school, but the reality was so much more tragic. His wife had died, and here he was, trying to keep teaching while quietly drowning in his grief. The pieces started to come together. The exhaustion, the accident, the sudden absence of passion, all of it made sense now. Mr. Reynolds wasn't just a tired teacher, he was a man who had lost the love of his life and was struggling to find a reason to keep going. As I left the principal's office that day, I felt an overwhelming sense of guilt. How could I, and everyone else, have been so blind? How many times had we complained about his disorganized lessons or his tired demeanor, never once stopping to consider that he was fighting an invisible battle? The next time I saw Mr. Reynolds, he looked even more fragile than before. His shoulders were slumped, and the light in his eyes had all but disappeared. But now, knowing what I did, I couldn't help but see him in a different light. He wasn't just a teacher anymore, he was a human being, carrying an unbearable weight. I wanted to say something, to let him know that we understood, that we were here for him. But how do you comfort someone in that kind of pain? What words could possibly ease the burden of losing a spouse? In the end, I didn't say anything. Instead, I worked harder in his class, paid closer attention to his lessons, and tried to show him, in my own small way, that I cared. I wasn't alone in this, some of my classmates did the same. We stopped complaining about his disorganized lessons and started helping each other more, trying to pick up the slack where we could. But despite our efforts, Mr. Reynolds didn't seem to get better. If anything, he grew more distant, more withdrawn. And then, one day, he simply didn't come back. The news spread quickly, Mr. Reynolds had taken a leave of absence. No one knew for how long or if he would return. It felt like the end of an era, and the sadness that lingered in our school was palpable. Years later, long after I had graduated, I found myself thinking about Mr. Reynolds. I wondered what had become of him, if he had found peace or if he was still struggling with the same grief that had consumed him back then. I never found out, but I like to believe that, somehow, he managed to rebuild his life, even if it took time. Looking back, I realized that the saddest thing I ever learned about a teacher wasn't just the story of Mr. Reynolds' loss, it was the realization that teachers are human too, with their own struggles and pain. They aren't superheroes, invincible and immune to the hardships of life. They are people, just like us, doing their best to get through each day. And sometimes, the battles they fight are ones we can't even begin to understand.